you all very badly, but we're very happy to be here. So this is a website webinar that is organized by the Civil Society FFD group and the Women's Working Group on FFD. And I'm Emilia Reyes. I'm one of the co-convener of the Women's Working Group on FFD, and I will be the moderator for today. We have an amazing lineup, and I'm going to be sharing with you some of the general ideas that we have in the FFD group so far. As you may know, there is this huge crisis that is being unfolding with many economic, financial, and trade implications. And so the FFD group has been thinking very deeply about this, and we think that this is the time to really call for action. This is a time in which the challenges are shared by the humanity as a whole, and we really need to think outside the usual boxes and the silos that we've been working so far. So this side event is a first attempt to make a joint call for collective action, in which we think that one of the first challenges is to return to the governance, to a democratic governance in the multilateral system. It's been widely known that this year the UN is turning 75 years we're celebrating its anniversary. But at the same time, this has a lot of implications actually in what is the composition of the global dynamics so far. On the one hand, we have many reasons to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the UN, but on the other, we are recognizing that it is undergoing a huge crisis. The multilateral setting as a whole is atomized. Many conversations are happening in different spaces, and also the decision making is also very polarized. And we think that at this moment, with so many crises, this is a time to return to the UN and to really have a proposal for addressing in a comprehensive manner the multiple challenges that we are seeing. So this is why actually we are calling for a more thorough understanding of what are the challenges, what are the systemic issues, and what are the structural points of entry of these challenges on the one hand, and on the other, to recognize that the current crisis is only unveiling past inequalities, such as, for instance, the way in which unpaid domestic and care work that has been produced by women is really subsidizing the entire economy. But added to that, we are seeing a deepening of the environmental crisis and really the depletion of the global South resources by the global North through many dynamics, such as illicit financial flows or corporate tax abuse, and even on the trade dynamics and stuff. So we will have our speakers to go in depth on some of these challenges, but I really wanted to start by highlighting that that we have a proposal as the FFD group to really address in a comprehensive manner the different challenges by means, on one, calling for an international economic reconstruction and systemic reform summit under the auspices of the UN. And we really want to call on member states to agree on such a summit at the UN General Assembly. And of course, there is a mandate under the FFD forum to monitor on these dynamics. So it is suitable precisely to host such a summit under the FFD mandate. And we are also thinking that this is not necessarily a technical issue. This is really a political issue, and this is why we're also making this call for social movements as a whole to rally around a structural and macro agenda, and to really address with more energy and also with more cohesion the challenges that we are seeing. We know that there are so far the local level is being the more impacted, but really no local effort, no national effort, and really no regional effort is enough to face and to solve the challenges that we are facing. So this is the time to go through a comprehensive proposal, and this is why we will be sharing across this side event. We will be sharing some elements of a more thorough proposal. You will find a link later on our paper proposing, for instance, some overarching principles of, so we want to do like a campaign of campaigns, like what are the main points of entry that all of us social movements should rally for. So we have framed some overarching principles, of course, human rights, gender equality, well-being, social, economic, and environmental justice, but also socioeconomic transformation and a just, equitable, and decolonial and feminist transition for people and the planet. Also, democratization of global economy governance and inclusive participation at all levels. And then we have a call for action of several issues. And I will just mention them very quickly. We are calling for debt cancellation and sovereign debt workout mechanism at the UN. Second, we are calling for an UN tax convention. 3, we are calling for a global technology assessment mechanism at the UN. 4, we are calling for assessing development impacts of current trade and investment framework. 5, we're calling for assessing systemic risks posed by unregulated or inadequately regulated financial sector instruments and actors. 6, we're calling for reviewing development outcomes of PPPs and private finance first approach. And 7th, a review of the ODA framework. We think that this is really a launch or a kickoff of this proposal to rally a more collective effort. We want to share with you some of these main elements by means of our amazing lineup of speakers. But we also want to say that this is the start of a conversation. This is a live document, so hopefully we will have political conversations with you so that we can find collective support. But without further ado, I will start introducing our first speaker, which is Dereje Alemajehu, who's the Executive Coordinator of the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, and he will go deeper precisely on the issues on debt and tax. So welcome, Dereje. It's my pleasure to introduce you to this side event. Thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Amina, for the introduction. A lot is being said, and Amina also repeated it in her introduction about the crisis of multilateralism. I would start by repeating what I said, also speaking on behalf of the CSO-FFD Forum at the UN side event last year in New York. I quote, one manifestation of the crisis of multilateralism is the effort to marginalize the United Nations. It is as if some are trying to make the United Nations hostage, the ransom to be paid being for it to abdicate from some of its key responsibilities to solve international challenges through illegitimate and inclusive intergovernmental processes. The two key challenges from which the UN is being forced to abdicate are forging international tax cooperation to end illicit financial flows, including tax avoidance, by setting up an intergovernmental tax commission within its auspices. The second one is the creation through the United Nations of a systemic, comprehensive, and enforceable process for sovereign debt restructuring. These challenges existed long before the COVID-induced health and socio-economic crisis, and the crisis has compounded them. And the crisis has made the role of the UN more important than ever. It is the only legitimate institution that can address challenges which would be overcome only through collective action. In particular, developing countries do not have any other forum to address these global issues. They can defend and safeguard their individual national interests only through collective action at the UN. There is a tendency to make any UN engagement less ambitious, the stronger the push to marginalize it becomes. There are even initiatives that readily accept a junior partner role for the UN with non-representative and undemocratic institutions dominated by rich countries. But this defeatist approach will only encourage and embolden those blocking any progress at the UN. For us, it is high time thus for the UN to be more ambitious and to rally nations and peoples behind a progressive and transformative agenda. That is why we say it is time for a UN Economic Reconstruction and System Reform Summit to chart the way forward towards a new global economic architecture that works for the people and planet. Within the context of such a summit, the FFD process will be reconfigured to fulfill its original agenda. That is, not so much as a fundraising exercise to finance the Sustainable Development Goal implementation, as some are trying to degrade it to, but more to create the policy space for developing nations to finance their development in a sustainable and adequate manner. The two challenges in this regard are interdependent. Increasing illicit financial flows and widespread tax evasion and avoidance are a huge obstacle to domestic resource mobilization. They perpetually reduce public revenue for the provision of adequate social services and to finance development. The recourse to borrowing to partly compensate for these revenue losses leads to increased borrowing, which inevitably reaches unsustainable levels. And debt servicing cripples financing development and provision of adequate services. The two essential means through which tax dodging and crippling debt burden could be overcome to this end would be to enhance intergovernmental process at the UN for international tax cooperation to curb illicit financial flows, including tax avoidance, and the creation through the United Nations of a systematic, comprehensive, and enforceable process for sovereign debt restructuring. A UN Economic Reconstruction and the Systemic Reform Summit should have the following two priorities in this regard. A, paving the way for a UN tax convention. It is time to back a truly universal intergovernmental process at the UN to comprehensively address the obstacles created by secrecy jurisdiction, tax abuse by multinational corporations, and other illicit financial flows that obstruct redistribution and drain resources that are crucial to challenging inequalities, particularly gender inequality. Taxing income, wealth, and trade should be seen to support the internationally agreed human rights frameworks, as without taxation, there cannot be available resources to fund them. Tax abuse and tax avoidance are also needed to need to be considered under the extraterritorial obligations of states towards other states, not to hamper the enjoyment of human rights by blocking financing through abusive tax laws, rules, and allowing companies and wealthy individuals to abuse tax system. In this regard, the second important agenda item for this summit would be paving the way for enforceable debt cancellation and sovereign debt workout mechanisms at the UN. Permanent cancellation of external debt payments for up to 4 years to all developing countries in need without penalties. Provision of additional emergency finance without creating more debt nor conditionalities. Protection of developing countries from lawsuits when ceasing debt payments at national and multilateral levels, a debt relief initiative to bring developing countries' debts down to sustainable levels and which consider countries' long-term financing needs to pursue their sustainable development goals, climate goals, and human rights and gender equality commitments. So an agreement on a permanent process under UN auspices to support systemic, timely, and fair restructuring of foreign debt is possible. To conclude, it is time for the UN not to abdicate or to give in to pressures, but to marshal its forces and support by leading peoples and nations towards a progressive and transformative agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Doreje. That was very sharp and on point. And I just wanted to highlight precisely that the difference between the type of proposals that Doreje was making and the ones that we are seeing now at the HLPF are starking. For instance, we were invited to submit a paper on sharing on what is the way in which there can be a sharing economic benefits of economic growth. And just for the start, the use of the UN of economic growth, it challenges in the recommendations themselves by the UN Human Rights Rapporteur on different issues. But the UN is still very much subsumed by the Bretton Woods institutions, and is even paying deaf ears to the recommendations, the ongoing recommendations of the UN Human Rights Rapporteurs. So it is really a time now to not only highlight what are the challenges in the global dimension, but really also to demand of the UN and of member states working at the UN to step up the game and to really call for the processes that we are needing right now. And in that sense, I will call on now to our next panelist, which is Raja Sengupta, who is a senior researcher of the Third World Network, to really talk to us about what are the trade demands that we are asking precisely in the current context of the multi-layered crisis. The floor is yours, Ranja.
Thank you, Amelia. And of course, it's always a pleasure to speak at events organized by the CSO-FFD group, of which we are also a member. So we are under challenging circumstances, but we also realize, right, collectively, that it demands action from all of us as a global community. So my job here is to speak about some of the trade and investment issues that we are grappling with. And I will just focus on some of the pandemic-related issues of trade, because we realize, sitting at this point in time, in the middle of this crazy pandemic, that trade rules have a lot to do with, it determines both where we are now and also the path where we'll go forward. What can we do? What can't we do, given the trade rules that all of our countries have kind of signed on to? The world, we are seeing a huge number of trade agreements. The WTO offers the multilateral space, but there are also bilateral, regional, plurilateral free trade agreements. And then we were not happy just with free trade agreements. So we have mega free trade agreements, we have investment agreements, and all these span different issues and chapters and instruments, starting from, this original traditional goods trade, like I give you this and you produce that and you'll give me that. So which we did more in terms of agricultural and industrial products. We moved on to liberalization of services. We included intellectual property rights, investment rules. Now we are talking about a whole lot of very modern new issues, high-tech issues really, e-commerce, government procurement, competition policy, state-owned enterprises, global value chains, and issues like that. And we realize that, the newer agreements and the newer issues that are being brought under these trade rules, they get deeper and deeper into regulatory policy areas of our governments. And it is impacting our government's ability to design and implement independent domestic policy. So if they want to follow or implement certain policies, they will be bound by the legal commitments in these trade agreements, right? So it has severely constrained policy space of our governments. So what does free trade tell us to do? It says that, the most efficient producer, let them supply. So you do not distort trade. Let goods and services and all these other products and policy issues, actually, let it do a free flow. Do not try to hold it back. So in terms of goods, for example, we've always been told, whether it's the WTO or FTAs, that, don't put up import duties, don't use subsidies, these are bad. But we have seen what it has done is increasingly created import dependence. We could have produced our own food. We could have produced critical products. Now, standing here, we'll always be discussing access to medicines, medical products, and food. I think these are some of the key things that we realize that we need now in the middle of the crisis. And we see that we don't have the ability actually to produce. Most of our countries, we do not have, and we are importing. So I'm not saying we don't need trade. Trade is hugely important. Very few countries can produce all they need, but we have seen trade rules destroy capacity of countries, especially developing countries, to produce, to have some sort of self-sufficiency, at least in key products, to create jobs, earn tariff revenue, and have freedom, independent regulatory space. So whether it's in the form of competition from subsidized agricultural products from Western countries, or a concentrated global market in health products, means medicines and other global, for example, health equipments like PPEs to ventilators to masks. And we see there's huge global concentration. Only a few countries are actually producing and exporting these. So we see we are losing our ability to produce and have any kind of self-sufficiency even in key products. But the promise given to developing countries that they'll have access to new markets has often not materialized. We also see increasing privatization, for example, of healthcare with high prices and so on. So in the pandemic, let me just give you some examples of what we are facing and all these weaknesses that we've built into the trade rules that especially the developed countries have forced on developing countries since the years of trade liberalization. They are now coming to roost. We see the ultimate manifestation when the crisis is happening. And remember, this is not the only crisis. We'll have environmental crisis. We'll have other giant crises later in the future. But what's happening now, one we are seeing is we are import dependent, as I said, for critical products. So we've been told, let the most efficient country send it to you. They'll export it to you. But countries are now putting up export restrictions. So which means that even if I want it, I don't have supply, but I will not be able to get it in terms of imports, because the exporting country may have to meet demand in their own country, right? And then we see when the supply is not adequate, then the highest bidder takes all. We've seen it in the case of remdesivir, in the case of masks, in the case of hydroxychloroquine, that the richest country is simply taking it all. And if you are an LDC country, then you are in an even bigger problem, right? So, but when countries start trying to say that, okay, we will pursue self-reliance policy of at least limited or strategic self-reliance, we'll do economic revitalization, we want to create jobs and incomes, they are being told, no, that's not done. Because the prescriptions that are coming out of the WTO is telling everybody to do the same, liberalize more, cut tariffs, do not restrict exports. So we are being given the same old trade policy prescriptions, which simply are not working. Then we also see in the pandemic, in the investment agreements give foreign investors huge rights to sue governments. So we have seen that even when governments are taking measures, policy measures to fight the pandemic, for example, I think in Peru, they had put up this COVID toll, and for a foreign company immediately sued them. So governments do not have the freedom even to take anti-pandemic measures under the investment agreements, because they can be sued. And intellectual property rights, it gives the innovator company, the company that holds patents, for example, say on medicines, which has led to, supply constraints and huge increase in prices. So if you were thinking that, you will get that new vaccine very cheap, you can forget about it, because it will be heavily patented. Remdesivir is costing, $2,340 for treatment per patient. In fact, it would have been over 3,000 if this dexamethasone hadn't come into the market. But what happens is intellectual property rights also limits the supply, because only one company holding the patent can produce it, right? So in my city, Delhi, remdesivir is being sold in black markets at 6 times the price, because there's no supply. So we see IPR creating a huge problem, and health services, we see private hospitals especially in developing countries, charging humongous amount for COVID treatment. So basically what we see is what trade policy has done so far is to create a big disjoint between what countries need now and what conventional trade policy has been prescribing. A clear disconnect between trade and human rights, trade policy and sustainable development goals, and it has not followed the FFT prescriptions either. So countries need policy space, which has been enshrined in the FFD Addis document and SDGs, but they don't have it under the trade policy. So basically, what do we need? We need a complete review and restructuring of trade policy and rules, which, Emilia, Dereje, they also highlighted as well, in the other areas of the FFD action areas. But we need policy which actually enables countries, especially developing countries, to formulate the trade policy they need that works for their people at large. And then you need, why does it have to be multilateral? Why can't it be done at the WTO? Because it needs a multidimensional and systemic approach which ensures a coordination between these different wings and instruments of the global economic architecture. So between tax policy, finance policy, debt and trade and technology and so on. And that's why we need to bring it to the UN, because trade decisions actually happen in the trade fora. They don't really happen so much in the UN. But I think increasingly we, civil society activists, and those who want trade to be linked to development, we are looking at the UN to provide solutions based on a true development interpretation of multilateralism that works for human rights development. It should work for the ordinary farmer, worker, patient, for women, for indigenous communities, and so on. Because these people who were on the fringes already are now simply about to go. They're already going under. And they do need policy that will be designed to actually give them their rights. We need trade to be linked to human rights mechanisms, to development mechanisms, because that link we don't see. We've heard a lot, trade and development and so on, but we don't see it. Nothing is delivered, nothing is there actually in implementation. So finally, in ending, let me say that we see the UN as a very important space for getting trade rules that actually work for people, that will help governments to come out of the pandemic. And so there were instruments like FFD and the FFD Review Forum, but which have been weakened so much. We need to go beyond. We need a more bigger, better coordinated, more radical approach. And I think the summit that Amelia has been talking about and the CSO-FFD group have really developed it so much. It's the need of the hour. We need to draw critical attention to these issues. We shouldn't shy away from expressing, radical thinking and thinking of, changing the whole global economic and financial system. So for trade, I won't get into specific prescriptions, but for example, how do we move away from import dependence for food and key products? For how do we move away from an IPR regime that constrains access to medicines? How do we ensure growth and jobs and decent jobs? How do we ensure environmental protection? How do we address inequalities generated and exacerbated by trade and investment rules, and so on? So I think a summit is very much needed, and we need to have that coordinated mechanism that will really make us how to rethink and redo the global economic architecture. Thank you so much. I hope I didn't exceed my time.
Thank you so much, Ranja. You were amazing. And I totally agree with that call for a radical proposal and a radical action. I think at this point, many decision makings are happening in different spaces like the G20. We know about that on the Paris Club. We know the conversations that are happening at the Bretton Woods institutions. But really, this proposal about having a UN summit would try to bring back the conversation, the regulatory conversation back to the UN on the one hand. Secondly, it will allow us to really address the interlinkages between different issues. For instance, this element of private companies being able to sue governments for unfulfillment of trade agreements. That can also happen under the private lenders on debt issues, on the private lenders suing governments. So there are many points of entry that are interrelated, and we really can bring more complex and really more effective solutions to the type of challenges that governments are facing nowadays. And on the other hand, we really need to have a space in which our rights are, as citizens engaging with this type of process, as right holders, are recognized. And so we really need to have one such a space. And finally, having the smaller countries seated at the table is crucial right now, precisely with environmental challenges, but also with the type of challenges that Ranja was mentioning on the issue on access to not only medicines, vaccines, treatments, technology, but also in relation to the food systems dynamics that are also challenged at the present moment. So I'm gonna now turn to our next speaker, Maria Jose Romero, who's the Policy and Advocacy Manager of Eurodat, and she will be speaking more on a very specific proposal, precisely in relation to private finance. So welcome, Maria Jose. It's an honor to introduce you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Emilia. I am happy to be with you today. This is a very timely discussion. And the first thing to say is that it is timely because COVID-19 has exposed and even amplified some of the key failures of the prevailing development model. And I will be speaking in relation to some of them today, particularly with regard to the policies promoted by the World Bank and in the International Monetary Fund. And I will then argue why we need a UN economic reconstruction and systemic reform summit along the lines of what you and colleagues have already mentioned. But to begin with, I would really like to emphasize the urgency of the moment. I think that a lot has been said about the COVID-19 crisis, but it's very important to have in mind that this is a health and an humanitarian crisis induced by COVID-19, but it's a crisis that has triggered a global economic crisis when the world was already in an environmental and a climate emergency. Debt levels in the global south were already at unprecedented levels before COVID-19, and the financing conditions have deteriorated sharply since the start of the coronavirus outbreak. And this is making borrowing and debt services even more expensive at the time when countries need resources the most. The World Bank estimates that between 40 and 60 million of people may be pushed into extreme poverty in 2020. So this is really a very urgent situation. And in this context, inequalities within and between countries have been exposed and even amplified. And it's clear that the pandemic has hit the lives of women, minority and poor workers the hardest. In this particular context, unpaid domestic and care work have once again stepped up to increase the already huge subsidy to the global economy. And I am pointing to all these because these clearly indicate how vulnerable the previous situation was. Nothing about this, it's really new. It's just that the COVID-19 crisis is exposing a reality that was very weak and precarious when it comes to the situation of most countries and people in the global south. The outbreak of COVID-19 has exposed the negative impacts of decades of structural adjustment policies, austerity policies, and the increasing reliance on the private sector for the provision of public services like health, education, etc. Neoliberal and austerity policies promoted by the IMF and the World Bank have undermined the capacity of public health systems to deliver in an effective and equitable way. And these policies have also negatively impacted on social protection mechanisms that reach the most vulnerable. Just to give you an example, In Ecuador, for instance, an IMF loan included reductions in public employment and lowered government wages, which resulted in 2,500 health workers being fired. Access to healthcare today is often determined by income, gender, and geographical location. And it's very clear for us that these should be reversed. These institutions have also promoted the liberalization and deregulation of different sectors of our economies, leaving countries vulnerable to the imperatives of private capital. And despite the negative impacts of this development model, the most recent World Bank Group strategy called Maximizing Finance for Development implies a very problematic private finance first attitude to development finance. It is based on a very unrealistic assumption that private finance will fill a so-called financing gap. Governments have been advised to prepare the ground for private investors and to engage in public-private partnerships to deliver infrastructure and public services. However, the evidence shows that there is very little ground to support claims that PPPs are able to deliver on the promises of the promoters. PPPs are usually very expensive and risky for the public sector and for citizens. And just to once again give one example, the Lesotho PPP hospital supported by the World Bank is a project that should teach us quite a lot of lessons. It consumes almost a third of the nation's health budget, and the government's bill to the private companies now reaching unaffordable levels. And as a result, civil society had been repeatedly warned against the emphasis on PPPs, saying that PPPs emphasize commercial imperatives, which might undermine the right to health, the right to education, to water, etc. And while donors and institutions promote a billions to trillions narrative, saying that they will use aid money to subsidize private finance, and in this way investment will come, the reality is that they are not living up to their own commitments and instead are regressing on some of them. So in this context, we think that it's very important to be clear on our asks. A lot is being said these days about emergency responses, but we think that these are not going to be enough if they are not tied to long-term structural changes. The model that has put development finance at the service of private finance has to be reversed. International financial institutions will need to commit to further debt cancellation and to a shift in their development, in their approach to development finance, away from austerity measures and market-friendly reforms, which have contributed to countries' vulnerability to exogenous economic shocks and risk increasing existing inequalities. ODA commitment, both in terms of quantity and quality, are key. And they have to be honored. In essence, we don't need to get back to what was the norm before COVID-19. We need a right-based recovery, and it has to be a green recovery to address the climate emergency, but it has to be a feminist and a right-based recovery to address inequalities and deliver for everyone. Finally, how to make this happen? And here we are calling for an international economic reconstruction and systemic reform summit, as Emilia and colleagues mentioned, under the auspices of the UN, as the UN remains the only place where developing countries are at the table with equal voice and vote. The summit should work towards a global consensus on a new global economic governance architecture that could foster systemic reforms while promoting human rights, gender equality, social equity, and environmental justice. The summit should ensure democratization of global economic governance, recognizing the right of every country to be at the decision-making table, and not only those who concentrated power or resources. In very practical terms, the summit should speak to some of the challenges and failures that I have mentioned before. The summit should create a framework for countries to have the policy space needed to regulate in the public interest and to ensure a feminist and just transition for people and the planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. We love it. And I have some questions from the audience for you. And I suggest I'm gonna read them, and you as speakers feel free to address them as you want. First, there is a question on what to do with those long-term loans that have been agreed already by the IFIs that are imposing conditionalities especially on austerity and privatization for years to come. That is one. Second is a question on taxation, what is called green taxation, which is related to taxation on fossil fuels and etc. And what is the position on this, and if that can be included in our proposal. Another question that has been already replied by Rosa, thank you, Rosa, hello, is how can we contact the FFD group to contribute with the document? And yes, we really want to have an ongoing conversation, so we very much welcome for you to contact us and have political conversations on this. There is also another question, and rather an engagement on how to promote acceleration and what is the type of acceleration that we can achieve with this proposal on the summit. I will stop here for now, and then we will get another round of comments and questions, and I'm inviting also the audience to keep on commenting and asking. So who wants to take the floor? There is
my suggestion is rather to also allow participants maybe to say a few things on these issues. Is it not possible for them to join? If there is anybody in the audience who will also be willing to contribute as an answer.
Yeah, they will have to write it down on the chat, and so this is a conversation that we can have as speakers while the audience is sharing on the chat their impressions. So perhaps, Rajit, do you want to talk on the conditionalities?
No, the problem with debt is always not only the fact that it has to be paid back, but the challenge of debt servicing. It is also the policy conditionalities that are attached to it, which deprive countries of their fiscal space and policy space to manage their economy in full sovereignty. We know this, in fact, as recently, since the onset of the crisis, I have read somewhere that the IMF is recommending further austerity measures to cut back public service pay at a time when it is so needed. So austerity measures and all the policy conditionalities have been always one way of enslaving developing countries to the debt burden and making them follow a certain ideology and economic policy which is not serving development. So my problem with debt has always been not so much the debt servicing itself, but also the policy constraints it brings with it. And the more indebted developing countries are, the more crippled is their policy space to do anything. And if you have seen how this, the whole negotiations are even structured, developing countries are not allowed to go to these meetings, Paris Club or London, as a group. They have to be individuals. The creditors are united, organized, the indebted countries should go to it. And even such mild demands like making debt servicing dependent on foreign exchange earnings, economic activities, all these things are permanently rejected. When in 2015, when the UN agreed on the principles of the UN General Assembly agreed on the principles of debt restructuring and about responsible borrowing and lending, the rich country delegates were saying there is no right to sovereign debt restructuring. The UN is not the place where these things could be negotiated. So it has become not only a financial means of enslaving developing countries, it has become a neo-colonial tool to dictate upon them which economic policies they are going to follow. So that is why in my short remarks earlier, I also said that these conditionalities are maybe worse than the debt servicing itself. So that is a very important aspect of the whole debate. It is about challenging these conditionalities which are policy-wise enslaving developing countries to debt.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to add the other questions so that the other two panelists can consider them. One is on, again, continuing questioning the term on green taxation or green recover. The other question is how to link the human rights and business process with this conversation we're having, and how to create momentum for this summit. So, Ranja or Maria Jose?
Yeah. Emilia, I am happy to respond to some of these questions because I think that it's critical to make the link between some of the points that Derece raised in his answer to the point on conditionality with the need for this summit. What this Reconstruction and Systemic Summit should do is to endorse a different narrative. This is a very important first step to get to a new recovery because all the public documents and the discourse coming from major countries and donor countries and multilateral development banks, it's a narrative that is emphasizing the role of private finance to deliver on the sustainable development goals. And we need to get out of this trap because it's not with private finance that we are going to be able to meet the sustainable development goals. Private investors are not going to deliver for the poor. They will seek a revenue stream as secure as possible, and for that countries will have to guarantee that. And I think that coming from a summit, what we need to get, or going out of a summit, what we need to get is a narrative in which governments and public systems are at the core of a development model, and in which governments have the capacity to regulate in the public interest. And this is a very important way for them to negotiate and to get response and support from the World Bank and the IMF, because they should have a different role to play, and they should coordinate with countries in a completely different basis than the ones that are prevailing today. For that, we need a summit, and we need a summit with concrete policy prescriptions to put developing countries in a different fit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria Jose. Ranja, you need to unmute.
Yeah, sorry about that. But so let me just jump in and quickly link some of these questions to trade, though there were no specific questions per se on trade. But one thing is what Kalyani talked about, a discussion and transparency. And Dereje was also kind of referring to it, and we see the height of secrecy in the trade negotiations, right? Like none of the bilateral free trade agreements, they are all secret texts, and even sometimes our state, the provincial governments, they get access only after the agreement has been signed. So we do need more transparency, we need more democratic process. I was thinking for the summit, there are certain problems which runs through all our action areas, and one is of course the role of corporations. And I know Ale asked the question about the business and human rights treaty. I mean, that negotiation is going on. We are so much, I'm sure all of us as a collective, as a group, we support it so much, but we don't know where that will go. But I think in different fora, in multiple fora, parallelly, we need to raise the issue of corporations. For example, entire trade policy is hijacked and determined by corporations based in the north. And so therefore, how do you, make them accountable? How do you discipline them? How do you regulate them? In the global space and in our national spaces remains a critical question. And one thing is, one reason why I had not come up with particular positive prescriptions for trade from the summit is, in a way, we are always saying, please just don't do anything. That will be the best solution, right? Like, just don't sign these agreements anymore. Just stop. Like, don't sign any more trade agreements. Don't give away any more policy space. So in a way, that is it. Like, when you review each agreement, each issue, then you see that what it has done broadly is harm, and therefore you do not do. But one positive thing that I would like to strongly advocate for is a review of the intellectual property rights regime, the rules and the role of not only the WTO in pushing these intellectual property rights rules, but also WIPO and other institutions. Because that, I mean, we realize from COVID, I mean, how will we pay these humongous prices for using medicines, medical devices, I mean, stent prices, pacemaker prices, ventilators, everything is expensive. And I think this global intellectual property rights regime really has to be disciplined. And just one last line, there were a lot of questions on the green. We are having this big green thing. We also get the gender and trade. And a lot of these are actually, they hijack the genuine concerns of different constituencies. For example, this big WTO gender and trade thing, it's hijacking, it's making use of the concerns of actual women's rights groups, grassroots women's and the women's organizations. And then it takes it and hijacks it and pushes the same liberal agenda. It just, so I think for the environment and the green thing, same danger is there in trade, and I know in the other areas as well. And that's something we need to kind of watch out for. So when we want, I very much agree, we want transformation, the summit to deliver on a transformative agenda. But we had heard it for the SDGs as well, and we have not seen a transformative agenda. But we often see these, our progressive terms, our progressive visions are hijacked for things, for policies that will actually damage us as, people at large. So that's something to watch out against. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the three of you. There are also some comments on how to move this forward in terms of gathering some member states support, whether if there's a possibility to maybe reach out to the G77. There is also a conversation that is very interesting precisely on these so-called positive use of conditionalities, but I think that was very well addressed by Ranja, and also in another comment by Stefano on why we are really promoting sovereignty, and not in the right-wing way, but really to expand on the policy floor, on the autonomy of governments to really decide on a comprehensive manner on precisely how to on the one hand promote a better expenditure, and on the other to not bleed out of debt payment services, or on the other dynamic on illicit financial flows, or these ISDS lawsuits, etc. So there are many ways in which strengthening the public sector can really help, and we don't need to rely on specific measures on a sectorial level that are not really encompassing or comprehensive. but also, so anybody wants to talk about this political dimension, and I really want to highlight how there is also a need for civil society and social movements to rally around this business and human rights process that is happening so far. It's going to be crucial for humanity, precisely because it's also linked in all of these issues that you're mentioning. So perhaps any of these elements wants to be taken by any of you panelists. We have 5 minutes before closing.
Personally, I will come back to this issue of ambition.
Yeah.
Because, when we are discussing about the UN being weak and the challenges being immense, there is this tendency of saying now the only achievable thing is small steps in the right direction type of thing. By making it less ambitious, we are not achieving anything. So this raising the ambition, and when I read the UN Secretary General asking the G20 to do this and that, instead of galvanizing the UN to play its role, when I see some UN agencies being happy to be junior partners of the OECD, the IMF, or the World Bank, which are rich country dominated, that is what should be reversed. Unless we challenge the UN to be more ambitious, to be an institution that mobilizes countries and peoples who have to fight for transformative goals, the game is lost. So it is very important to emphasize this aspect of be ambitious, be bold, mobilize countries and peoples to achieve transformative change. That is the message we have to inculcate into the UN system and member states. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? There are also proposals by Butch Montes on starting for cleaning up the multiple and contradictory disciplines from treaties such as BITs, FTAs, and the WTO, but also perhaps calling for member states to convene study commissions for different areas of interest. So there are also, I'd say, some interest on these proposals. Anybody wants to comment on how to move member states on supporting these type of proposals? Ranja or Maria Jose?
Thank you, Emilia. I would like to also comment on the question or the point raised by Rick Roden on the Stiglitz Commission. I think that it's very important to learn lessons from that process and be able to avoid getting into the traps or the problems that process had. There were a lot of good proposals coming out of this commission, and I think that going forward, it's very important to get support from member states to have this reconstruction summit. And the proposal that Butch raised is extremely relevant because I think that it's not possible to create this alternative narrative that I mentioned without actually evaluating from a very thorough and comprehensive approach the results of the model being applied so far. So coming from these studied commissions, we can get an evaluation from a human rights perspective on the impact of some of the policies promoted so far, with very practical implications on the way out and the transformative agenda that we have been discussed here. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria.
I'll quickly put in 2-3 lines. I think one is, I think Butch's, of course, from Butch's long experience, his comments are, we knew it, they are very valuable. And I think they give us very good ideas to, to bring to the summit, because we don't want the summit to be a space where we simply criticize everything and we do not have any constructive suggestions. And so that's what we are making across these FFD action areas. And for trade, as I said, the danger is always we say, no, we don't want anything. So it would be good to ask the summit to, for example, look at these conflicts between different kinds of agreements, as Butch suggested, or look at, I saw one question is that we are talking about, I talked about import dependence, but what about also how poorer countries, because during the SDG negotiations, it was so interesting, the African countries kept talking about the structural transformation that they need. They need industrialization. They don't want to be locked into just, producing primary goods and agriculture goods, and they are basically, all their resources are extracted. So how do they move from that? What would be a constructive, positive trade agenda? I think that would be very important to bring to the summit. One thing on the UN, we definitely, I agree, we want the UN, we look to the UN to provide solutions, but at the same time, UN also has to be accountable, it has to be questioned, and it has to address criticism at itself. Only then it can improve as an institution. And when we talk about multilateralism, I think we should always qualify the multilateralism. Amelia, we've been having some of these discussions, right? We don't want any multilateralism. I mean, WTO is also a multilateral institution, but frankly, we don't like most of what it's doing. So we want multilateralism that is that has the values that we want, that works for people and for the planet. And I think so, and one thing is this this question of conflict between trade agreements. We are seeing that, and commitments in one area is actually coming up against commitments in other areas. So I'm not sure how that will be actually taken up by governments, how seriously, when you say trade will be discussed in some other fora other than WTO and these bilateral negotiations, they are always hesitant. I think we'll have a lot of work to do there. But I think increasingly we are seeing a policy also of localization. Even the US is talking about raising tariffs to become self-reliant, right? And then when developing countries do it, they will say, no, you are doing bad things. So that cannot be the case. I think each country post this pandemic will be looking at not becoming entirely local. I mean, that is probably not realistic anymore, but how do they have more, local economies, local food, jobs for your local industry, jobs created by local industry, and so on. And I think we have to seriously then think what would be that model, and then what kind of global economic architecture can support those kind of initiatives. I mean, that's where we start. We do not take trade policy as given and then you trying desperately to fit your domestic needs in with your commitments at the trade level. But what you do is you first decide what your domestic needs are, and then your trade policy, IPR policy, everything will come second. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, Diana is already having a very constructive proposal to dismantle the Bretton Woods and WTO and imagine a new system for trade and development, which we totally support. That is the type of constructive proposals we have. And I just wanted to also, before closing, to invite us all to make a political pact on this radical ambition that all of our speakers have been talking about. We are mapping member states and stuff, but really I think that the first type of mapping is across social movements, and to really rally together to support these structural agendas that are impacting us all in different levels. And there is an isolation on the environmental movement on the one hand, the trade unions on the other, indigenous peoples on the others, human rights defenders, those working on debt, or others on tax, or others at the local level against extractive mining. So we really need to rally together for these type of proposals, and perhaps working on a roadmap on what are the upcoming events and how we can really support these type of strategies that are more encompassing, more structural, and in the end, they are really the ones that are draining the local level, the national level, the regional level. So building alliances, gathering support, this is the type of dialogue we need to do at this moment across constituencies and movements, and showing solidarity within and between movements. So this is the first call for this CSO FFD group and the Women's Working Group. And second, yes, let's take the world by storm. So thank you so much for everybody who has been joining us. And thank you so much for your radical proposals as well. This is precisely what we need. And I will close with a call that made by Ranja. The time to act is now. The time to act radically is now. So we are looking for your support. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.